Welcome back in Solitude with me, DJ Hero. In this video, I want to talk about gain staging and a little bit about clipping. I recently received an Ableton project from someone. When I opened it and pressed play to give the track a listen, I was shocked to see that every channel was epically peaking in the red, basically pegged at the top. Not a single meter moved as the song played. So I thought it might be a good idea to talk about gain staging and clipping. First off, what is gain staging? According to the internet, gain staging is the process of managing the relative levels in each step of the audio signal flow to prevent the introduction of noise and distortion from feeding into the inserts, such as equalizers and compressors, particularly in the analog realm. Or more simply put, making sure that no plugin or channel is peaking for the sake of good sound quality. But Hero, you say, that definition clearly says, particularly in the analog realm. That is correct. When we push an analog signal beyond 0 decibels, we're effectively pushing the electrical circuitry beyond what they've been designed to handle. That can add distortion and noise to the signal output. As well, it can potentially damage the equipment itself. With that said, digital clipping also comes with some side effects, mainly the squaring off of your waveform. Let's take a look here. I've got this basic sine wave kind of set up here, and it's actually on Serum. So it's just a basic sine wave. Here it is, nice and clean. We're going to record it here so you can see it. And if we take a look at the waveform, it's got nice round peaks, right? That's good, clean audio. It could stand to be a little bit louder. Seems like there's a bunch of overhead here. But if we were to push this beyond the 0 decibels, just to see it, and just to let you know, there are no effects on the channel, so I don't have anything running in tandem here to cause any artifacts in and of itself. But if we were to record this, pushing the limits, the levels beyond 0, we'll just crank it all the way up here, right? We get and if we take a look at this, you can see we've squared off the sine wave on the peaks. That is what happens. That is digital clipping. With this simple example, we can see how pushing the simple sine wave beyond 0 has flattened out the peaks, consequently distorting the audio, right? And while this effect actually has some creative usefulness, especially in bass-focused music like drum and bass, dubstep, dub, things like that, some of those left field genres as well. From a mixing and mastering point of view, clipping is bad. It doesn't sound good. It's not going to add any good qualities to your mix as a whole. So I had to ask myself, why do producers tend to produce their tracks in the red? My guess is because it's louder. And in today's world, louder is better, supposedly. I'm not a huge warrior in the loudness war. I feel that if you think your track still maintains the level of quality you want it to have as it's pushed to its loudest levels through limiting, then who am I to judge? Who am I to say that loudness is a bad thing? However, that is dramatically different than a track that has been pushed to the point of distortion in its mission to be loud. But let's back up. We can make a track loud through proper limiting once we've completed the production of our track. We shouldn't be trying to get that loudness during the production process. That's the job of mastering. And I hate to break it to you, but you can't master a track before it's been produced or before it's been properly mixed. If you want your track louder during the production process, my advice, turn the volume up on your speakers, not your DAW. So let's go over properly gain staging all of our plugins and channels so that we know we've left enough overhead to cleanly mix and master our music. Before we get started, I don't subscribe to the idea of this 6 decibel of overhead. That's a common concept in the mastering world. I think that concept is a bit antiquated. Instead, I say produce the track as loudly as you can without any limiters before you get any sort of clipping on any of the channels. The reason I say this is because of something called the noise floor. The noise floor is the resting decibel level of background noise caused by things like the quality of cabling throughout your studio, the quality of the gear you're using, and more importantly, the electrical signal from your computer, your sound card, and any other gear in the studio. This equipment just being powered on creates an electrical signal that permeates everything in your signal chain. Electricity is just inherently noisy. I'm going to call everything above the noise floor and below 0 dB, so we'll just say negative 0.1 dB, we're going to call that clean audio. With that said, I firmly believe we want to maximize the amount of clean audio we have so that when we get to the limiting during the mastering stage, our signal to noise ratio is maximized. Ergo, we have the loudest track possible before we begin the mastering process. If we can produce clean audio above that kind of 6 decibel of overhead rule of yesteryear, then we, more than likely, have the ability to produce a higher quality and a much louder final product. I'll go as far to say that if you can produce your music closer to 0 decibel than negative 6 decibel, you're more than likely making good use of proper EQing and compression techniques, as well as making good use of my V theory, meaning you've efficiently placed all of your sounds in the box and filled that box up as much as possible. If a channel clips, turn it down, either by simply turning the channel down or by decreasing the output of the plugins on the channel. The latter of the two is more likely the better choice. If when you turn it down, that sound is too quiet in the mix compared to all of the other sounds that it's been playing with, then turn all of those other sounds down equally to match. First things first, let's start with one sound. I've got a basic kick drum loaded up here. It has no effects on it, and as you can see, it's peaking by 1 decibel. The first thing I'm going to do is check the volume of the sample to see if that can be adjusted. For whatever reason, when I loaded the audio clip for the kick into the DAW, it increased the output of the sample by 1 decibel. Easy enough. Let's bring that back down to 0. Now that the basic sample is no longer clipping, I'm going to add some EQing to shape the sound a little bit. And as you can see, by adding and adjusting the EQ, the output of the signal has bumped back up above 0 decibel. So time to gain stage and bring that back down. Keeping in mind what I said, produce as loudly as possible. I'm only going to decrease the signal enough to reduce it back to just a smidge below 0, that negative 0.1. Too much. There we go. And of course, if you've watched my previous videos, you know I like the output of my kick to be -7 decibels. I feel that gives me enough overhead for every other sound once I'm done. So I'm going to add a limiter, setting the threshold and a ceiling so that my output is ultimately -7 decibels. The threshold will be set to match what the sample is currently peaking at. So give it a play here. Without it, just to double check. So we're at -0.03, so we'll do, -1's perfect, right? Good deal. Perfect. And then of course the output of the limiter is now set to -7 to give me my desired output there. Setting that limiter to that -7, that's my way of building my constant in this giant equation of producing music. One variable that doesn't change. That, in kind of the algebra sense, having one variable that you have already solved for, one constant, allows you to solve the equation. I know that it shouldn't be that mathematical, but it's a good analogy there. It's the one sound that I produce all other sounds around, essentially. But moving on to the percussion. I've added a few different percussive elements and staged them individually, just like I did with the kick drum. Additionally, I've given them a little bit of a rough mix down. You can see here, they're kind of set so that they sound good together, right? They sound like a cohesive grouping of sounds. And here's where the next issue comes into play. Even though the individual sounds are peaking, when they're summed together in the bus winds up clipping. The solution could be either turn the bus channel down like this, add a plugin that allows me to decrease the input, like that. Or turn all of the sounds down in the bus until the bus itself is no longer clipping. That is the one that I feel is the best option. I don't want to rely on other plugins, and I don't want to have the actual volume of the bus itself be the thing that decrease or stops the clipping, because I want to be able to adjust that freely in the overall mix down process. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn all of these down equally until the clipping goes away. Now what I do for this is I will typically turn everything down far more than needs to, and then slowly move everything back up until we're just below that clipping, or right at the 0 level. So still clipping, I'll turn it way down, clear out my clipping, and then turn it all back up until we are at the greatest level that we can be. So back off just a little bit there. Perfect. And now the bus is no longer clipping. So now I want to move on to processing this bus with some plugins to kind of just fill out and produce that group of sounds a little bit better, to make that percussion a little bit more glued together, have a bit more harmonics, all that good jazz. So on this bus, I'm first off going to add some compression. The compressor is going to glue the sounds together a little bit, but also save a little bit of overhead. that compressor is basically reducing the volume of the peaks of all of the sounds, as well as reducing or increasing the floor. We're essentially decreasing the dynamic range, and the reason the compressor is the optimum choice here over a limiter is that compressor is going to let go once those peaks are grabbed, right? It's basically going to go, okay, peak, 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 grab, let go. That's what the attack time and the release time is. And the ratio is how much are we going to decrease for every signal or for every volume, decibel of volume over the threshold. So once I've adjusted the threshold to my tastes, pretty good right there. I'm going to increase the output of the compressor to make up for what I've reduced through the reduction of the threshold here. So let's take another look. We're at about negative 2.3, 2.4 decibels, so we'll just start by 2. Still got a little bit left. Oh, too much, so back off a little bit from there. A little more. That's pretty good. Now, after the compressor, I want to add some saturation to add harmonics to this group. Once I've got that saturation set, we're going to reduce the output of it to make sure, again, gain staging to make sure there's no clipping here. So let's take a look. Add the saturator. Again, peaking a little bit there, so we'll decrease negative 6.63. Perfect. All right. And then, of course, to shape the sound a little bit more, I'm going to add an EQ after the saturator to kind of balance the frequencies out a little bit. And you can see here, just by making the adjustments that I've made, it's caused the signal to peak again. So we're going to reduce this by negative 4.1. Perfect. Clear that away to make sure. Let it run a little bit just to make sure. And we're good. I also want to add a little bit of reverb from a bust, a send, so that the group itself has a little bit of reverb on it. Now, if I were to turn my send up all the way, we're pretty good, no clipping. But if there was some clipping, we just turn this bus down a little bit, or we could decrease the output of the EQ a little bit more to give us a little more overhead for the reverb. But in this case, we're pretty good. Nothing's peaking here. The group is mixed relatively well, at least to how I want it. And as a whole, we're looking pretty good. Now that the drums have been bussed, processed, and gain staged, I can add the kick drum back and make the final adjustments to this drum bus so that everything sits nicely together. But let's move on to another sound here. Let's say we want to have, or we're going to have, a rather complicated effects chain, or a lot of different plugins affecting the initial signal for the sound that we've got. I've got this rather simple kind of growl bass coming from Serum here. Take a look at it first. Sounds like this. Once I've created the sound how I want it in Serum, or whatever VST you might be using, whatever synth you might be using, first up, I'm going to stage the actual VST's output to maximize the volume levels. And that looks probably the best we're going to get, the closest we're going to get, that negative 0.3 with a rather intricate sound that's got a bunch of LFOs and some automation. You're probably not going to get it exact at the negative 0.1, not without some sort of limiting first, but we're going to avoid all that, right? Moving on to the effects chain. First, I've added an instance of Ableton's Erosion to add a little metal kind of to the top end. Right here. Sounds a little like this. And it's still not clipping, so we're good. We don't have to make any adjustments. After that, I've added an instance of the OTT, the famous over-the-top multi-band compressor, and I've got it set so that it's kind of affecting or creating the sound the way I want it to be. Sounds like this now. And by doing this, we've actually decreased the volume a little compared to what it was before. So I'm going to use the output to make up that additional headroom. Pretty close. Oh, a little too much, so we'll back off. That's one thing about the OTT that's a bit annoying, is it will sometimes pop at the beginning of the loop when it's first taken to effect. So, pretty good right there. Once I've got the OTT and got that set, I'm going to add a little bit of reverb to the mix. Pretty dry, it's only 30%, rather short decay time, sounds like this. That actually might be too much reverb. We'll back that off a little bit. I actually peaked a little bit there. So because the reverb doesn't have an output of its own, we're going to step back to the output of the OTT and reduce that to get rid of that clipping. Perfect. And then after the reverb in the chain, I've got saturation. Got it set the way I want it to. But with it set the way I want to, obviously, dramatically increases the volume. So 3 decibels, a little more than 3 decibels. So we'll do negative 3.2. Where are we at? Perfect. And then last in the chain here, I've got this EQ. And I've made some adjustments to it. I have increased the bass. I've notched a little something out here around where a clap or a snare, the body of a clap or a snare might sit. And I've increased the edges, the sides, the left and right of the stereo spectrum on the high end a little bit to give it a little more width in the mix. And then as a whole, I've rolled off the extreme high end to leave more room for my percussion to sit. And before any sort of staging, the additional EQing has again raised the volume enough that we've got some peaking. So we're going to reduce that by, what, negative 0.8? Let's see if that's enough. Perfect. So in short, as you add each plugin to the chain, affecting the sound more and more, regardless of what that effect is doing or what that plugin is purpose on the sound, you should A, make sure the input into it is not peaking, and B, after you've made all of the adjustments to the sound, make sure that the output of that plugin isn't peaking, so that none of the plugins in the chain, including the synth producing the sound if you're using a VST, are peaking or clipping or surpassing 0 at any point in time. At the end of, regardless if you've got 2 plugins or 50 plugins, At the end of that chain, you want it to still be at 0 or just a smidge below 0 or as close to 0 as possible without any sort of peaking. The next step from here is to add the bass sound to the percussive sounds. Essentially, just like as we're finishing our tracks, we're mixing, right? We're adding all of the pieces together and creating one whole audio experience, one track, one song if you've got vocals in there. So as we add more signal to our project, ultimately that signal has more and more risk to clip. It's going to get louder and louder and louder. Potentially, we have to take that into consideration. So first, I know my kick is constant. I'm not going to change it. That means I have to think about how to save overhead on all of the other sounds, the percussion and the bass line that we've got thus far in our small little project here. What I do is first I create a pre-master bus and route everything but the kick to it like this. First we add an audio track. Next we set the input to in. Right? Next, I want to route the grouping for the percussion to that channel. And I'm going to route the bass line to that channel. I don't know, I'm going to really quickly name and color it. I'm going to call it pre-master. Now, all of the sounds except for the kick drum are routed to that pre-master. The kick is still being routed to the master. That's just the way I like to do it. Why? Again, back up a few steps. I want my master to be -7 decibels at all times. If I routed that kick drum to the pre-master, what would end up happening is whatever effects I do on the pre-master is also going to affect the kick and then change the output of the kick, which I don't want. I want it to be a constant -7 decibels at all times. So all other sounds except the kick are going to route to that pre-master. And if I were to get more clever, what I typically do with a really complex song, just a quick pro tip here, is I'll have 2 buses. One will be the pre-master, and then one will be another bus that feeds into the pre-master. The pre-master then feeds into the master. And what I'll do is I'll route all of my percussion to the pre-master, and then every other sound except the kick into the pre-master, which then leads to the pre-master. So I can kind of use a multi-band compressor to compress all of my melody elements, my vocal elements, my bass line elements, and then feed it to where the percussion is, bus those together, and compress them however I want them to be gently, whatever needs to do there, and then sum them together with the kick in the master. That's complicated. I'm going to save that for another video, but for the sake of this, I've routed all of my percussive elements to the pre-master, I've routed my bass line to the pre-master, and my kick still going to the master itself. So just to give a listen to the pre-master on my little grouping here. And you can see that by bussing them all together, I've actually got a little bit of clipping on here. Now that might be my EQ, so let me mute that really quick. Oh, a little bit of clipping. So we need to do something to take care of that. First things first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it all down. We're going to grab the percussion bus and the house bass line that I've got, and we're going to reduce. Start off a whole bunch, clear the clipping away, and then we'll turn it up until it's not clipping. Back off a little bit, let it play. Back off some more. -0.16 is pretty good, so that's where we're going to be. And then it feels like my bass line's a little quiet, so I'm going to turn it up just a little bit. Make sure we're not clipping. We're good. Oh, little too much. So gather these back, turn them down a little more. Perfect. From here, I'm actually going to add just a quick compressor, just something gentle. Ratio of 2, pretty fast attack, and slow the release down a little bit. And I'm not going to do too much. I'm just going to glue them together a little bit. And then let's pay attention to the output here. I'm going to turn up the output of the compressor. Oops, too much. Well, it doesn't get any better than that, does it? Perfect. And then I've added an EQ here. And all the EQ is doing at this point is cutting off everything below 20 hertz and cutting off everything above 16,000 hertz, not clipping. If I were to check my master just to get a sense of the actual balance, looks like I could actually have a little more high end. So that's, what is that, right around 1,000 hertz. I'm going to increase that. I'm going to set this to shelf. Put in 1,000. I'm going to turn it up. Oh, not that button, this one. Just to get a little more balance. Now you can see when I added my shelf here, we got a little clipping. So let's stage that and bring it back down. Perfect. Now what does it sound like when I add the kick back in? And you can see, not clipping there. Where are we clipping here? Not clipping there. No matter how complicated the mix, no matter how many plugins on the channel, no matter how many channels you have, pay attention to the output of everything. A clean signal leads to a clean mix, which leads to a clean master. If you're pumping every plugin and every channel into the red, you're going to distort your audio. And while distortion can be used as a tool, having it be the result of poor engineering is just bad form and creates a bad sound. If you're using limiters to place a hard ceiling on your channels to prevent clipping instead of turning the signal down before it clips, what you risk is 1, squaring off the waveform, and 2, raising the noise floor, reducing the amount of space available for clean audio, ultimately lowering the quality of your track. So here's a quick recap. Gain staging is extremely important to prevent clipping, which can cause distorted audio. Normalize the source of the audio. Either turn the synth down or turn the synth up so that it is as loud as it can be before you get any sort of peaking or clipping. Then, as you add effects to the chain on that audio, normalize their output to prevent any clipping. As you add more and more tracks, turning all of the channels down as a whole to prevent any clipping on the master. Clean audio leads to a clean mixdown, which leads to a clean master. Don't be the artist that pegs the red, either as a DJ or as a producer. If you need more volume while you're producing, turn your speakers up, not your DAW. If you have any additional questions or if you have any ideas for future videos, please leave a comment below. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification button. And if you want more from me, search Originaldjhero, all one word, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, SoundCloud, and Mixcloud, or search DJ Hero on Beatport, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. Until next time, good luck and have fun in your own production. Keep it clean.